I talked to John Mearsheimer recently. There's a lot of people that believe NATO had a big contribution to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So what role did NATO play in this full history from Bucharest in 2008 to today?
NATO was a big part, certainly, of the Russian justification for the war. That was the theme that was up there in the months leading to the aggression. The truth is that, and Vladimir Putin went on record saying that the Western leaders were telling him again and again that there is no chance for Ukraine to become a member of NATO anytime soon. Russia was very effective back in the year 2008 in stopping Ukraine and Georgia on the path of joining NATO. There was a Bucharest summit at which the US president at that time, George W. Bush, was pushing for the membership. And Putin convinced leaders of France and Germany to block that membership. And after that, membership for Ukraine and for Georgia was really removed from the realistic agenda for NATO. And that's what the leaders of the Western world in the month leading to the February 2022 aggression were trying to convey to Vladimir Putin. What he wanted there was an ultimatum that really was there to not to start negotiations, but really to stop negotiations. He demanded the withdrawal of NATO to the borders of the 1997, if I am not mistaken. So completely something that neither leaders would accept nor the countries members of NATO would accept. But for me, it's very clear that was an excuse, that was a justification. And what happened later in the year 2022 and 2023 certainly confirms me in that belief. Finland joined NATO, and Sweden is on the way to joining NATO. So Finland joining NATO increased border between Russia and NATO twofold and probably more than that. So if NATO is the real concern, it would be probably not completely unreasonable to expect that if not every single soldier, but at least half of the Russian army fighting in Ukraine would be moved to protect the new border with NATO in Finland. So I have no doubt that no one in Kremlin, either in the past or today, looks favorably or is excited about NATO moving, or the countries of Eastern Europe joining NATO. But I have very difficult time imagining that was the primary cause of the war. And what we see also, we talked about Tucker's interview. He was surprised, but he believed that Putin was completely honest when the first 25 minutes of interview he was talking about relations between Russia and Ukraine, was talking about history. And that was also the main focus of his essay. Essay was not on NATO and Russia. Essay was on Russia and Ukraine. So that is where the real causes are. The broader context is the fall of empire and process of disintegration of empire, not the story of NATO.
What was, to clarify, the reason Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022?
The immediate goal in 2014, when the war started, was to stop the drift of Ukraine toward the west and outside of the Russian sphere of influence. The invasion of 2022 perceived the same goals, keeping Ukraine in the Russian sphere of influence. Once we have the resistance, quite effective resistance on the part of Ukraine, the Rammstein and coalition, international coalition in support of Ukraine. Then we see the realization of Plan B, where parts of Ukrainian territory are being annexed and included in the constitution of the Russian Federation. So the two scenarios don't exclude each other, but if scenario number one doesn't work, then scenario number two goes into play.
In the Gates of Kiev chapter, you write about Volodymyr Zelensky in the early days of the war. What are most important moments to you about this time? The first hours and days of the invasion.
The first hours and the first days were the most difficult psychologically. The rest of the world really didn't expect Kiev to last for more than a few days, didn't expect Ukraine to last for more than a few weeks. And all the data suggested that that's what would happen. Ukraine would collapse, would be taken over. Putin called his war a special military operation, which suggests you also expectations about the scope, expectations about the time. So semi-military, semi-police operation. So every reasonable person in the world believed that that would happen. And it's the heroism of quote-unquote unreasonable people, like Zelensky, like the commander of Ukrainian armed forces Zaluzhny, like mayors of the cities, Klitschko and others. I'm just naming names that are familiar to almost all of us now. But there are thousands of those people, unreasonable people, who decided that it was unreasonable to attack their country. And that was the most difficult times and days. And speaking about Zelensky, every, I understand, reasonable leader in the West was trying to convince him to leave Ukraine and to set a government in exile in Poland or in London. And it was reasonable to accept his one of his predecessors, Mr. Yanukovych, fled Kiev. A few months before that, in Afghanistan, the president of Afghanistan fled Afghanistan. That was a reasonable thing to expect. And he turned out to be very, very unreasonable in that sense. That comes with the guts, his guts and guts people around him and Ukrainians in general.
Why do you think he stayed in Kiev? This former comedian who played a president on TV when Kiev is being invaded by the second most powerful military in the world.
Because I think he believes in things. And one of those things was that if he a president and he is in the presidential office, he is there to play his role to the end. And another thing, my personal, again, I never met Volodymyr Zelensky. My personal understanding of him is that he has talent that helped him in his career before the presidency and then helps now. He feels the audience and then channels the attitude of the audience and amplifies it. And I think that another reason why he didn't leave Kyiv was that he felt the audience. The audience in that particular context were the Ukrainians.
So he had a sense that the Ukrainians would unify, because he was quite, if you look at the polls before the war, quite unpopular. And there was still divisions and factions, and the government is divided. I mean, there's the East and the West and all this kind of stuff. You think he had a sense that this could unite people?
The East and the West was not already such an issue after Crimea and part of Donbass being gone. So Ukraine was much more united than it was before. He brought to power his, before that, really non-existent party of regions on his personal popularity, but the important thing is that he created a majority in the parliament which really reflected the unity that existed among Ukrainians that was not there before. He won with 73% of the population. Of those who took part in the elections. His predecessor, Petro Poroshenko, also carried 90% of the precincts, and the same happened with Zelensky. So the country unified after 2014 to a degree it was impossible to imagine before, and Zelensky felt that. Zelensky knew that. And that's where the talent of politician really matters. So that's something that you can see beyond just data, and you can feel that. Apparently, Yeltsin had that ability.
Why did the peace talks fail? There was a lot of peace talks.
Well, the main reason is that the conditions that Russia was trying to impose on Ukraine were basically unacceptable for Ukraine. Because one of the conditions, apart from this strange thing called denazification, was, of course, de facto loss of the territory, and for the future, really staying outside either of NATO or any Western support, which was very clear. You can buy a couple of weeks, you can buy a couple of months, but in the conditions like that, Russia will come back tomorrow and will take over everything. And once Ukrainians realize that they can win on the battlefield, once the Russians were defeated and withdrew from Kiev, the opportunity emerged to get out of the negotiations, which was very clear were leading, if not today, then tomorrow, to the complete destruction of Ukraine. And then, of course, once the territory started to be liberated, things like Bucha and massacres of the civilian population came to the fore, which made also quite difficult, if not impossible, to conduct negotiations from this moral and emotional point of view.
What about the claims that Boris Johnson, the West, compromised the ability of these peace talks to be successful? Basically, kind of manipulated the talks.
I asked people who accompanied Boris Johnson to Kiev that question. The answer was no, and I believe this answer, and I'll tell you why. Because it is very difficult for me to imagine President Zelensky to take orders from anybody in the world, either Boris Johnson or Joe Biden or anybody else, and basically doing things that Zelensky believes are not in his interest or in the interest of his country. I just can't imagine that anybody in the world telling Zelensky what to do and Zelensky actually following it against his own wishes and desires, at least if that is possible. What is in the public sphere doesn't allow us to suggest that it is.
That said, Zelensky is a smart man, and he knows that the war can only continue with the West's support.
That is a different supposition to know that it can continue with the West's support. But if we are talking about withdrawing from the negotiations, that's not about the continuation of the war. For that, you don't need Western support.
Well, what I mean is, if he started to sense that the West will support no matter what, then maybe the space of decisions you're making is different.
We can interpret that way. But Boris Johnson represented, at that point, Britain, not the United States. And really what the war showed, and it was clear already at that time, that what was needed was massive support from the West as a whole. And the promise of that support came only after the West realized that Ukraine can win, and came only in late April with the Ramstein, so at least a few weeks later. So I don't know how much Boris Johnson could promise. He probably could promise to try to help and try to convince and try to work on that. If Zelensky acted on that promise, he certainly was taking a risk. But the key issue, again, I'm going back where I started, it's a principle, an acceptance for Ukraine, the conditions that were offered. And Ukraine was, the moment they saw the possibility that they could fight back, with Johnson's support, without Johnson's support, they took the chance.
So what are the ways this war can end, do you think? What are the different possible trajectories, whether it's peace talks? What does winning look like for either side? What is the role of U.S.? What trajectories do you see that are possible?
It's a question on the one level very easy to answer, on the other very difficult. The level on which it is very easy, it's a broad historical perspective. If you really believe, and I believe in that this is the war of the Soviet succession, that this is the war of the disintegration of empire, we know how the story ends. And they end with disintegration of empire. They end with the rise of the new states and the appearance of the new colored spots on the map. That's the story that started with the American Revolution. So that's long-term perspective. The difficult part is, of course, what will happen tomorrow. The difficult part is what there will be in 2 days or even in 2 years. And in very broad terms, the war can end in one of 3 scenarios: the victory of one side, the victory of another side, and a sort of a stalemate and compromise, especially when it comes to the territories. This war is already approaching the end of the second year. I follow the news and look analysis. I don't remember one single piece suggesting that the next year will bring peace, or will bring peace for sure. And we are in a situation where both sides still believe that they can achieve something or improve their position on the battlefield. Certainly, that was the expectations of Ukrainian side back in the summer and early fall of 2023. And from what I understand now, this is certainly the expectations of the Russian side today. This is the largest war in Europe since World War II, the largest war in the world since Korean War. And we know that the Korean War ended in this division of Korea, but the negotiations were going on for more than 2 years. While those negotiations were going on, both sides were trying to improve their position there. And until there was a political change, death of Stalin, arrival of Eisenhower in the United States, and the realization that the chances of succeeding on the battlefield are huge, the peace talks didn't come. So at this point, all 3 scenarios are possible. I don't really discount any of them. It's early to say what will happen.
So without any political change, let's try to imagine, what are the possibilities that the war ends this year? Is it possible that it can end with compromise, basically at the place it started?
Meaning back to the borders of 2022?
Yeah, back to the borders of 22 with some security guarantees that aren't really guarantees, but are hopeful guarantees.
No, it is not just virtual impossibility. It is impossible without political change in Moscow. The reason is that back in the fall of 2022, Vladimir Putin included 5 of Ukrainian regions, oblasts, even those that he didn't control fully, into the Russian constitution, which basically, in simple language, is that the hands are tied up not only for Putin himself, but also for his possible successors. So that means that no return to the borders of 2022 without political change in Moscow are possible. A few days after that decision in Moscow, Zelensky issued a decree saying that no negotiations with Russia. What that really meant in plain language is that basically we are not prepared to negotiate a stable agreement with 5 of our oblasts, not just annexed, but also included into the Russian constitution. So that's where we are. So that scenario is again, everything is possible, of course, but it's highly unlikely.
So the Russian constitution is a thing that makes this all very difficult.
Yes, and not only as a negotiation tactic for Putin or whoever would negotiate on the Russian side, but also as a legal issue.
So like the practical aspect of it even is difficult.
Yes, you really have to change the constitution before the peace agreement takes hold or immediately after that. And with the Minsk agreements, that was one of the things that Russia wanted from Ukraine, change of the constitution. And it turned out to be really impossible. So that's one of the backstories of the Minsk and collapse of the Minsk agreements.
Is there something like Minsk agreements that are possible now to, maybe this is a legal question, but to override the constitution, to sort of shake everything up? So see the constitutional amendment as just a negotiation tactic to come to the table to something like Minsk agreement.
Given how fast those amendments to the constitution were adopted, that suggests that really executive power in Russia has enormous power over the legislative branch. Mm-hmm. So it's again difficult to imagine, but technically this is possible again possible if there is a political change in Moscow.
I don't understand why, assuming political change in Moscow is not possible this year. So I'm trying to see if there's a way to end this war this year, right?
There is a possibility of armistice, right? But armistice more along the, like any armistice, along the lines of the current front lines. But withdrawal of the Russian troops to the borders of 2022 at this point, whether it's reasonable or unreasonable, can be achieved only as the result of the defeat of the Russian army, like it happened near Kiev. Is it possible? Possible. Is it likely, especially given what is happening with the Western support, military support for Ukraine? Probably not.
But if Putin, the executive branch, has a lot of power, why can't the United States president, the Russian president, the Ukrainian president come to the table and draw up something like the Minsk agreements, and then rapid constitutional changes made, and you go back to the borders of 2022, before 2022, like through agreements, through compromise? Impossible for you?
Certainly not this year. I look at this year as the time when at least one side, Russian side, will try to get as much as it can through military means.
But that's been happening last year too. There's been a counteroffensive. There's been attempts.
It doesn't mean that that new year somehow is supposed to bring new tactics. The last year was pretty much a lot of fighting, a lot of suffering, very little movement of the front line. The biggest change of the last year was Ukraine victory on the Black Sea, where they pushed the Russian Navy into the western part of the pond and restored the grain corridor and export from Odessa, apparently up to 75% of what it used to be before the war. So that's the only major change. But again, the price is enormous in terms of wealth, especially in terms of lives.